Something is shifting in the global balance of power, and most Americans haven't noticed it yet. A war that appears to be unfolding in the deserts of the Middle East may quietly be redrawing the strategic map of the Pacific Ocean. And the countries that depend the most on American strength, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, are watching with growing unease. Before we begin, take a second to support the channel. If you value clear, fact-based analysis about global politics and economic power, subscribe and help us keep producing these deep dives that explain what's really happening behind the headlines. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today we break down what's shaping our world. At first glance, the latest escalation between the United States, Israel, and Iran looks like another chapter in the long history of Middle Eastern conflict. American forces have reportedly struck more than 1,700 targets across Iran. Radar sites, missile launch systems, command facilities, naval assets in the Persian Gulf. President Donald Trump has declared that Iran's military infrastructure has been severely degraded, arguing that Tehran's radar networks, air defenses, and much of its naval capability have effectively been knocked out. On the tactical level, the mission seems straightforward. Neutralize Iran's capacity to threaten regional stability and prevent a wider escalation that could disrupt global energy markets. But geopolitics rarely operates on a single level. The deeper story isn't just about Iran. It's about how power moves across the global system when one crisis demands the attention of the world's most powerful military. And this is where the anxiety begins to spread far beyond the Middle East. In Taipei, Tokyo, and Seoul, if defense planners are quietly asking the same question, what happens if the United States becomes deeply tied down in another Middle Eastern conflict? For 70 years, the architecture of security in Asia has rested on one fundamental assumption. American power is present, credible, and capable of responding rapidly to any major threat in the region. The United States Navy patrols the Pacific. American intelligence networks monitor contested zones. American alliances create a strategic shield that prevents regional rivalries from turning into open conflict. But military power, even at the scale of the United States, operates within constraints. Aircraft carriers cannot operate simultaneously in every ocean at maximum readiness. Intelligence assets must prioritize one theater over another. Political focus inside Washington, arguably the most limited strategic resource of all, inevitably concentrates where crises become most urgent. Right now, that urgency is shifting toward the Middle East. And when the strategic spotlight moves, other regions begin to feel the shadows. For China, this dynamic is not an accident. Beijing has spent decades studying how great powers manage multiple theaters of competition. Chinese strategic doctrine places enormous emphasis on patience and timing. The objective is rarely to confront American power directly. Instead, the goal is to observe moments when the global balance becomes fluid, when resources, attention, and political capital are stretched across multiple fronts. This is the quiet opportunity structure that emerging powers look for. China does not need to intervene in the Iran conflict to benefit from it. If the United States becomes heavily engaged in Middle Eastern operations, deploying naval groups, missile defense systems, intelligence resources, that inevitably creates adjustments elsewhere in the global military posture. Even temporary adjustments can alter perceptions, when perception is a powerful force in geopolitics. For allies like Taiwan and Japan, the concern is not that the United States will suddenly abandon the Pacific. The concern is subtler, but no less serious. They worry about a temporary imbalance, a strategic moment when America's attention is divided and regional actors may test the limits of deterrence. History shows that great power competition often unfolds during precisely these moments. And wars rarely remain confined to the region where they begin. They reshape the calculations of countries thousands of miles away. What we are witnessing today is not just a military campaign against Iran. It is a stress test for the global system of alliances that the United States built after World War II. And the question now echoing across the Pacific is simple but profound. When an answer begins to look uncertain, even briefly, other powers will notice. And when they do, the consequences rarely remain contained to one battlefield. The two-front dilemma, America's strategic overstretch. Great powers rarely collapse because of a single enemy. They collapse when they are forced to fight too many battles at the same time. That lesson runs like a thread through modern history. Empires overstretch, resources thin out, attention fractures, and eventually strategic discipline begins to erode. Today, the United States is approaching one of those moments where the structure of power itself is being tested. Not because America is weak, but because the demands placed on it are growing faster than any single nation can comfortably manage. The emerging conflict with Iran is not simply another regional crisis. One that raises an old strategic dilemma that every major power has faced at some point in history: the danger of a two-front geopolitical confrontation. In Washington's case, the two fronts are clear. The first lies in the Middle East, where U.S. and Israeli operations against Iran have escalated into a campaign targeting the regime's military infrastructure. President Donald Trump has framed the strikes as a necessary action to prevent Iran from threatening its neighbors and destabilizing global energy markets. From a tactical perspective, the operations are meant to degrade Tehran's capacity to project force. But while the military focus shifts toward Iran, another strategic theater remains just as critical: the Indo-Pacific. That is where the long-term contest between the United States and China continues to unfold. It is not a shooting war, at least not yet, but it is a competition over economic systems, technological leadership, supply chains, and military positioning across the world's most economically dynamic region. Managing one of these theaters would already demand extraordinary attention. Managing both simultaneously requires an enormous concentration of resources, logistics, and political will. The problem is not that the United States lacks military strength. On paper, the American military remains unmatched. Its global logistics network, intelligence infrastructure, and technological advantage still provide capabilities that no rival can easily replicate. The real challenge lies in allocation. Aircraft carrier strike groups cannot be everywhere at once. Missile defense systems must be deployed where the threat appears most immediate. Intelligence satellites, reconnaissance aircraft, cyber operations teams. Every piece of the national security system must prioritize one theater over another. When a major conflict erupts in the Middle East, those priorities inevitably shift. Naval assets move toward the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea to secure energy routes and deter escalation. Intelligence platforms are redirected to monitor Iranian command structures and missile activity. Diplomatic attention inside Washington becomes consumed by managing alliances in the region and preventing a wider war. None of these decisions are irrational. In fact, they are strategically necessary in the short term. But they create ripple effects across the global balance of power. Because while the United States concentrates resources on Iran, China continues to expand its military presence in the Pacific. The People's Liberation Army Navy has grown into the largest naval force in the world by ship count. Beijing continues to invest heavily in anti-access missile systems, long-range surveillance, and maritime patrol capabilities designed specifically to challenge U.S. dominance in the region. China's strategy does not rely on immediate confrontation. It relies on gradual shifts in the strategic environment. From Beijing's perspective, a United States engaged in multiple crises presents an opportunity, not necessarily to provoke a war, but to test the limits of American deterrence. Every great power competitor studies these moments carefully. They examine how quickly resources can be redeployed. They observe whether alliances remain confident. They analyze whether domestic political divisions inside the United States begin to constrain long-term strategy. This is where the economic dimension becomes equally important. A war is not only fought with missiles and aircraft, it is also fought through industrial capacity, supply chains, and fiscal endurance. Sustained military operations require massive expenditures, logistical networks, and political support at home. When a nation begins to divide its attention across multiple theaters, the financial burden multiplies rapidly. For the United States, maintaining global leadership has always required balancing these pressures. The question now facing Washington is whether it can sustain decisive pressure on Iran while simultaneously maintaining overwhelming deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Because if that balance slips, even slightly, The implications will extend far beyond the battlefield in the Middle East. They will shape how allies calculate risk, how competitors measure opportunity, and how the next phase of global power competition unfolds. Or Taiwan's anxiety. The island watching the Middle East. Taiwan sits at the center of one of the most fragile balances of power on Earth. It is a democratic island of 23 million people, positioned less than 100 miles from the coast of China, and it exists under a constant shadow of strategic pressure. For decades, that pressure has been contained by one central factor: the credible presence of American power in the Western Pacific. But when crises erupt elsewhere in the world, places like Taiwan begin to listen carefully, not to what is said publicly, but to what is happening quietly inside the global system of power. Right now, as U.S. and Israeli operations against Iran expand in the Middle East, analysts in Taipei are watching events unfold with a mixture of caution and calculation. On the surface, the conflict is geographically distant. The missiles, the naval maneuvers, the diplomatic confrontations are thousands of miles away. Yet in strategic terms, the consequences of that war could reach directly into the Taiwan Strait. The reason lies in how deterrence actually works. Taiwan's security has never rested solely on its own military capacity. The island has modernized its defenses significantly in recent years, investing in anti-ship missiles, air defense systems, and asymmetric warfare capabilities designed to complicate any potential invasion scenario. Expectation is not written in a formal treaty. Instead, it exists as a carefully constructed strategic ambiguity, one that has preserved peace for decades. China cannot be certain how Washington would respond, but it must assume that American forces could rapidly project power into the region. And that uncertainty has been enough to prevent a catastrophic miscalculation. However, deterrence is not static. It evolves with perception. When military crises emerge elsewhere, especially conflicts involving large-scale U.S. operations, the strategic equation begins to shift in subtle ways. Decision-makers in Beijing examine not only the military actions themselves, but the broader pattern of global resource distribution. They study where American naval groups are deployed, and where intelligence assets are concentrated, and where political attention inside Washington is focused. In that context, a major conflict involving Iran raises an uncomfortable question for Taiwan. What happens if China concludes that American attention is divided? China's leadership has spent decades preparing for a potential confrontation over Taiwan. The People's Liberation Army has invested heavily in missile forces, naval expansion, cyber warfare capabilities, armored and aerial surveillance networks. The strategy does not necessarily require an immediate invasion. Instead, it relies on layered pressure, military exercises, airspace incursions, maritime patrols, and economic coercion designed to gradually shift the balance of control in the Taiwan Strait. Over the past few years, that pressure has intensified. Chinese aircraft now cross the median line of the Taiwan Strait with increasing frequency. Large-scale military drills simulate blockade scenarios. Warships circle the island in demonstrations that are designed as much for psychological effect as for operational preparation. From Beijing's perspective, these actions serve two purposes. They test Taiwan's defenses while also probing the reaction time and commitment of the United States. This is why events unfolding in the Middle East matter so deeply to strategists in Taipei. If the United States remains fully capable of sustaining operations against Iran while maintaining overwhelming presence in the Pacific, the deterrent structure holds. China observes American resilience and recalculates its timing. But if the conflict expands and begins to demand sustained deployments, additional logistics, and prolonged political focus, Beijing may interpret that situation differently. Not as a moment for immediate war, but as a moment to increase pressure and test the boundaries of the system. History shows that major geopolitical shifts often occur during periods when great powers are managing multiple crises simultaneously. For Taiwan, the concern is not that the United States will disappear from the region. The concern is that even temporary adjustments in force posture or strategic attention could encourage risk-taking by competitors who are watching closely. And Taiwan understands better than most how quickly strategic signals can travel across oceans. A missile launch in the Middle East can change the calculations of generals in Beijing. A naval deployment in the Persian Gulf can influence patrol patterns in the Taiwan Strait. A political decision in Washington can reshape the psychology of deterrence across an entire region. In an interconnected world of great power competition, no battlefield exists in isolation. For Taiwan, the war against Iran is not just a distant conflict. It is a reminder that the stability of the Pacific can depend on events unfolding half a world away. Japan's strategic nightmare, a gap in U.S. defenses. Japan understands something about geopolitics that many countries only learn the hard way. Security gaps rarely appear with warning. They emerge slowly, quietly, often during moments when global attention is focused somewhere else. And that is exactly why Tokyo is watching the unfolding conflict with Iran so carefully. Japan sits on the front line of the Indo-Pacific security architecture. For decades, it has served as one of the most critical pillars of American power projection in Asia. U.S. forces stationed in Japan form the backbone of Washington's ability to respond quickly to crises across the Western Pacific. Naval forces operate from Yokosuka. Air power is staged through Okinawa. Logistics networks spread across the Japanese archipelago support everything from surveillance missions to rapid deployment operations. This infrastructure is not just symbolic. It is the operational center of gravity for U.S. military presence in the region. But Japan also understands a structural reality about global military power. Even the strongest alliance system depends on how resources are distributed across theaters of conflict. When tensions escalate in the Middle East, especially when they involve direct U.S. military operations, the calculus inevitably begins to shift. Strategic planners in Tokyo know that naval deployments toward the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea do not occur in isolation. Carrier strike groups that move toward one theater must come from somewhere else. Intelligence assets, missile defense platforms, and logistical support chains must be reassigned to meet the most immediate threats. Whilst the United States still possesses enormous global capabilities, no serious strategist in Japan doubts that reality. But the concern in Tokyo is not about whether American power exists. The concern is about how quickly that power can be concentrated when multiple crises unfold simultaneously. Japan's security environment is already among the most complex in the world. To the southwest lies the Taiwan Strait, where tensions between China and Taiwan continue to escalate. So to the west sits the East China Sea, where territorial disputes over the Senkaku Islands have intensified in recent years. To the north stands North Korea, whose missile tests and nuclear ambitions add another layer of uncertainty to the regional balance. Each of these challenges demands attention. Each requires a credible deterrence posture, and each relies heavily on the stability of the U.S.-Japan alliance. For decades, that alliance has operated under a simple strategic principle. Forward presence prevents conflict. When American naval forces patrol the Pacific and U.S. air assets maintain constant readiness across the region, potential adversaries must factor that power into every decision they make. But deterrence works best when it appears seamless. Any perception that defensive coverage might weaken, even temporarily, can invite probing behavior from competitors. China has become increasingly active in the maritime spaces surrounding Japan. Chinese Coast Guard vessels regularly operate near the Senkaku Islands, asserting territorial claims that Tokyo strongly rejects. Naval patrols in the East China Sea have grown more frequent. Airspace incursions near Japanese defense zones have increased steadily over the past decade. None of these actions represent open conflict. Instead, they are part of a long-term strategy often described as gray zone pressure, when the objective is to test responses, normalize presence, and gradually reshape the operational environment without triggering a direct military confrontation. From Beijing's perspective, moments when global attention is divided can accelerate this process. If the United States becomes deeply engaged in prolonged operations against Iran, China may not immediately escalate militarily, but it could increase pressure in other areas. More patrols, more exercises, and more demonstrations of presence around contested waters. Those moves serve a strategic purpose. They test how quickly American and allied forces respond when the global system becomes stretched. Japan has already begun preparing for this possibility. In recent years, Tokyo has taken steps that would have been politically unimaginable just a decade ago. Defense spending is increasing significantly. Japan is acquiring long-range strike capabilities, including Tomahawk missiles. They designed to give its self-defense forces the ability to counter emerging threats. Military cooperation with the United States is expanding in scope, with greater emphasis on joint operational planning across the Indo-Pacific. These changes reflect a quiet but important shift in Japanese strategic thinking. Tokyo is no longer assuming that the regional balance will remain permanently stable. Instead, while Japanese leaders are preparing for a world in which multiple crises can unfold simultaneously, and where even the strongest alliances must adapt to a rapidly evolving global landscape. For Japan, the war against Iran is not just another distant geopolitical event. It is a reminder that security architecture depends not only on strength, but on attention. And when the world's most powerful military begins focusing heavily on one battlefield, every other region starts calculating what that might mean for the balance of power. In Tokyo, those calculations are already underway. China's energy lifeline. Why Iran matters to Beijing. Energy is the quiet engine behind every major geopolitical rivalry. Nations may speak the language of ideology, sovereignty, and national pride, but beneath those narratives lies a much simpler reality. Modern power runs on fuel. Without stable energy supplies, factories stop, shipping lanes slow, and economic growth begins to fracture. This is where the war involving Iran intersects directly with China's long-term strategic ambitions. For Beijing, Iran has never been just another partner in the Middle East. It has been an energy lifeline, one that quietly supported China's industrial expansion while bypassing many of the geopolitical constraints imposed by Western sanctions. Over the past decade, China has become the dominant buyer of Iranian crude oil. In some periods, Chinese buyers have absorbed nearly 90% of Iran's oil exports. Before the latest escalation in the region, China was importing more than 1 million barrels of Iranian oil per day. That flow did not always appear in official statistics, because much of it traveled through what analysts call the shadow trade, complex shipping routes that pass through intermediary ports such as Malaysia and Indonesia before reaching Chinese refineries. And the system was designed to avoid sanctions while delivering something both sides desperately needed. Iran received a steady stream of revenue despite international pressure. China received heavily discounted oil, often $8 to $10 per barrel below global market prices. Those discounts may sound modest, but across millions of barrels, day after day, year after year, they translate into billions of dollars in economic advantage. For China's manufacturing economy, that advantage matters enormously. Energy costs ripple through every layer of industrial production. Lower oil prices reduce transportation costs, stabilize factory output, and strengthen export competitiveness. In effect, cheap Iranian oil functioned as a quiet subsidy for China's global manufacturing machine. But wars have a way of disrupting the economic systems that great powers quietly rely on. The recent military operations against Iran have already begun to threaten the infrastructure that makes this energy relationship possible. Oil terminals, shipping networks, and logistical routes in and around the Persian Gulf operate within a fragile environment. Even the perception of risk can cause shipping companies to pause operations, insurers to raise premiums, and energy markets to tighten. When at the center of this vulnerability lies one of the most critical choke points in global energy supply, the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's traded oil normally passes through this narrow waterway each day. Tankers carrying crude from Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and other Gulf producers must navigate this route before reaching international markets. If tensions escalate enough to disrupt traffic through the strait, the consequences would ripple across the entire global economy. For China, the stakes are especially high. Unlike the United States, which has dramatically expanded domestic energy production over the past decade, China remains heavily dependent on imported oil. A significant portion of those imports comes from the Middle East. Iranian supplies, discounted and politically flexible, have played an important role in stabilizing that dependency. If the conflict involving Iran continues to intensify, Beijing could face an uncomfortable economic adjustment. Chinese refineries would likely be forced to replace discounted Iranian oil with higher-priced supplies on the global market. That shift would increase production costs across China's industrial sectors. Energy prices would climb, transportation costs would rise, and the competitive advantage that cheap oil once provided would begin to erode. For an economy already navigating slowing growth, real estate instability, and rising debt pressures, such changes could become strategically significant. This is why China's public response to the conflict has been carefully calibrated. Beijing has condemned the escalation and called for an immediate halt to military operations. Yet beyond diplomatic statements, China has shown little willingness to intervene directly. The calculus appears clear: protect long-term economic interests while avoiding entanglement in a volatile military confrontation. In many ways, as the situation reveals a deeper contradiction in China's global strategy, Beijing has built extensive economic relationships across the Middle East, investing in infrastructure and energy partnerships through initiatives such as the Belt and Road. Yet when those regions become unstable, China still depends heavily on the United States and its allies to maintain the broader security framework that keeps global trade flowing. That dependence creates a strategic tension. Its China benefits from stability in the Middle East, but it has limited capacity or willingness to enforce that stability itself. As the conflict involving Iran unfolds, the question facing Beijing is no longer simply about diplomacy. It is about whether the energy architecture supporting China's economic rise can remain intact during a period of growing geopolitical turbulence. Because when the flow of oil becomes uncertain, the balance of power inside the global economy can begin to shift just as quickly as the balance of power on the battlefield. Technology and power, the failure of Chinese and Russian defense systems. Military technology is more than hardware. It is a signal. Every radar system, missile battery, and air defense network represents a promise that a country can protect its skies, defend its infrastructure, and deter its enemies from striking first. When that promise fails in real combat, the consequences go far beyond the battlefield. The recent military campaign against Iran has revealed something that defense analysts around the world are now studying with intense attention: the apparent collapse of air defense systems that were largely built using Chinese and Russian technology. Iran has spent years constructing a layered defense network designed to shield its strategic facilities. This network included radar installations, surface-to-air missile systems, and command structures meant to detect incoming aircraft and intercept precision strikes. Many of those systems were developed with foreign assistance. Russian defense technology played a central role in earlier phases, while Chinese equipment and components reportedly supplemented parts of the network over time. On paper, such a system should have created a formidable barrier. Layered air defense operates on a basic strategic principle: multiple detection and interception systems overlap in order to create depth. If one radar fails, another detects the threat. If one missile battery misses, another intercepts the target. The goal is to create enough defensive complexity that attacking forces must expend enormous resources just to break through. Yet the early stages of the strikes against Iran suggest that this system was rapidly neutralized. Reports indicate that radar installations were disabled, command networks disrupted, and key missile systems destroyed before they could mount an effective response. Instead of a prolonged battle between defensive layers and incoming aircraft, the result appears to have been a rapid degradation of Iran's ability to detect and respond to attacks. This outcome highlights the growing role of modern warfare technologies that extend far beyond traditional missiles and aircraft. Electronic warfare has become one of the most decisive tools in contemporary conflict. Most sophisticated systems can jam radar signals, confuse detection networks, and blind air defense operators before physical strikes even begin. Cyber operations can infiltrate command systems, disrupt communications, and paralyze coordination between defensive units. When these capabilities are combined with precision-guided weapons and real-time intelligence, the result can be devastating for defensive systems that rely on conventional architectures. In other words, the battle is often decided before the first missile is fired. For countries that have invested heavily in Chinese and Russian military technology, the implications are significant. Both Moscow and Beijing have marketed their defense systems as viable alternatives to Western military equipment. Air defense platforms developed by Russia, along with various Chinese missile and radar systems, have been exported across the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. These technologies form part of a broader geopolitical strategy. By selling military systems abroad, China and Russia strengthen political partnerships while expanding their influence within regional security structures. But credibility in the global arms market depends on battlefield performance. When a defense network collapses quickly under sustained pressure, other countries begin to question whether the systems they purchased will function as advertised. While military procurement decisions are rarely driven by ideology alone, governments want systems that work, and that is where the strategic implications become even larger. The People's Liberation Army has invested enormous resources into building layered air defense networks along China's coastline. These systems are designed to detect and deter any attempt by foreign forces, particularly the United States, to operate freely near the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. If similar technologies fail in real combat environments, military planners across the Indo-Pacific will begin asking uncomfortable questions. How resilient are these systems under electronic warfare pressure? How quickly can command networks be disrupted? And how effectively can advanced air forces penetrate layered defenses that appear strong on paper? None of these questions produce immediate answers. Warfare is never identical across different theaters, when in China's defensive infrastructure is far larger and more sophisticated than Iran's. But strategic perception matters. When military technology fails publicly, it reshapes how nations calculate risk. For the United States and its allies, the lesson may reinforce confidence in the advantages created by decades of investment in advanced warfare systems, cyber capabilities, and integrated command networks. For China and Russia, the moment carries a different message. And the reputation of their military technology, an important pillar of their global influence, now faces a new and very visible test. And in the world of great power competition, credibility can be as powerful as missiles. The political battlefield in Washington, wars abroad rarely remain purely military events. In the United States, every major conflict eventually opens a second battlefield, one that exists not in the air or at sea, but inside Washington itself. That battlefield is political. And when a conflict expands quickly, as the confrontation with Iran has, the struggle over strategy, authority, and national priorities begins almost immediately inside the halls of Congress. At the center of the debate is a question that has haunted American foreign policy for decades. Who ultimately decides when the United States goes to war? President Donald Trump has argued that the strikes against Iran were necessary to prevent a larger catastrophe. His administration has framed the operation as a defensive action, one designed to stop a regime that has spent decades supporting militant groups, threatening regional stability, and pursuing advanced weapons capabilities that could dramatically alter the balance of power in the Middle East. From that perspective, the logic is simple. If a hostile regime is preparing to strike or rapidly expanding its military capabilities, waiting too long could produce far greater consequences. Acting early, according to this view, preserves strategic advantage. But inside Congress, the reaction has been far more divided. Some lawmakers, particularly among Republicans, have supported the administration's position, arguing that Iran's long record of attacks against American interests justifies decisive military action. For these members of Congress, the conflict represents an opportunity to weaken a regime that has challenged the United States and its allies for more than 4 decades. They see the moment not as an escalation, but as a long overdue correction in American strategy. Other voices in Washington view the situation very differently. A number of Democratic lawmakers have warned that military strikes without explicit congressional authorization could pull the United States into a prolonged conflict without a clearly defined objective. Their concern is not only about Iran itself, but about the precedent of expanding military operations without full legislative approval. That concern has revived a familiar constitutional debate. Under the War Powers Framework, Congress retains the authority to declare war, while the President serves as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. In practice, however, modern conflicts often begin through executive action before Congress formally weighs in. Over time, this dynamic has created a gray zone in which military operations can expand faster than political consensus. The current conflict with Iran is now pushing that tension back into the spotlight. Lawmakers are already preparing to vote on measures that would require explicit congressional authorization for continued military involvement. These proposals are not merely procedural. One, they represent an attempt to reassert legislative influence over the direction of American foreign policy during a rapidly evolving crisis. But the debate inside Washington goes beyond legal authority. It also reflects deeper questions about national priorities. The United States is simultaneously confronting multiple strategic challenges: rising competition with China, ongoing tensions in Eastern Europe, and instability across several regions of the Middle East. Each of these challenges demands resources, attention, and long-term planning. For some policymakers, opening another front against Iran risks stretching American capabilities too far at a moment when global competition is intensifying. For others, failing to confront Iran now could embolden adversaries and undermine deterrence across multiple regions. Public opinion adds another layer of complexity. American voters remain deeply cautious about prolonged foreign wars after 2 decades of military engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq. While many support decisive action against threats, there is also strong skepticism about open-ended conflicts that lack clear exit strategies. Political leaders in Washington are acutely aware of that sentiment. Every military decision now unfolds under the shadow of domestic political calculation. Congressional hearings, intelligence briefings, and public statements are not only about national security, they are also about shaping the narrative that will influence voters in the months and years ahead. Meanwhile, America's competitors are watching closely. China, Russia, and other global actors understand that the United States derives much of its strength from internal unity during moments of crisis. When political divisions deepen, strategic decision-making can slow, and adversaries may begin to test the limits of American resolve. That is why the political debate in Washington matters far beyond the Capitol. It is part of the broader global contest over credibility, leadership, and the ability of democratic systems to respond decisively during moments of international tension. On the battlefield, missiles and aircraft determine the outcome of individual engagements. But in Washington, the outcome of the political struggle will help determine how long the conflict lasts and how the United States positions itself in the next phase of global power competition. The real strategic question: who benefits from a long war? Every war creates destruction, but every war also creates advantage for someone. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of global geopolitics. Conflicts are never just about the battlefield. They reshape economic flows, redistribute strategic attention, and quietly alter the balance of power between nations. So the most important question surrounding the current confrontation with Iran is not only how the war unfolds militarily. The deeper question is this: if the conflict continues, who ultimately benefits from the passage of time? President Donald Trump has framed the military strikes as a decisive move designed to neutralize Iran's capabilities quickly. The objective, according to that argument, is straightforward: degrade the regime's military infrastructure, prevent further escalation, and restore stability before the situation evolves into a broader regional war. In the best-case scenario, such an operation would produce a rapid strategic outcome. Iran's capacity to threaten neighboring states would diminish, energy routes through the Persian Gulf would stabilize, and the global economy would regain a measure of predictability. In that outcome, the United States and its allies would reinforce a powerful message. When a destabilizing actor crosses certain lines, the response will be swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. That kind of outcome strengthens deterrence. It signals to adversaries that the cost of aggression is immediate and severe. It reassures allies that American leadership remains decisive even in moments of high uncertainty. But wars rarely follow best-case scenarios. History shows that the most difficult conflicts are not those that begin suddenly, but those that slowly stretch into long campaigns without clear endpoints. When that happens, the strategic dynamics change dramatically. A prolonged war consumes attention. It consumes resources. And most importantly, it consumes political bandwidth. The United States possesses enormous military strength, but even the strongest global power must constantly decide how to allocate its energy. Every additional deployment, every extended operation, every escalation requires more logistics, more intelligence, and more financial commitment. Over time, these demands accumulate. This is where the geopolitical equation becomes more complicated. If the confrontation with Iran were to evolve into a prolonged standoff, years of pressure, intermittent strikes, rising regional instability, the global system would begin to shift in subtle but important ways. China, for example, it would not need to fire a single shot to gain strategic breathing room. While Washington remains heavily engaged in Middle Eastern security, Beijing could continue strengthening its economic networks, expanding its military presence in the Indo-Pacific, and consolidating influence across emerging markets. The longer American strategic focus remains divided, the more space other powers gain to advance their own objectives. That dynamic has appeared repeatedly throughout history. We great powers rarely lose dominance through sudden defeat. More often, they gradually disperse their attention across too many challenges at once. Competitors then move patiently, taking advantage of the moments when strategic concentration weakens. This does not mean the United States is destined to fall into such a trap. American power remains extraordinarily resilient. Its alliances are strong, its economy remains one of the most innovative in the world, wherein its military capabilities continue to outmatch any single rival. But resilience alone is not strategy. The real strategic challenge is maintaining clarity of purpose across multiple crises simultaneously. If the conflict with Iran ends quickly and decisively, the global message will be unmistakable. The United States can confront regional threats while maintaining stability across the wider system of alliances. But if the war stretches into an open-ended confrontation, the consequences will unfold far beyond the Middle East. Energy markets will remain volatile. Political debates inside Washington will intensify. Allies across Asia will watch carefully for signs of distraction. Competitors will study every deployment, every budget decision, every moment when American focus shifts elsewhere. And that is why the central question surrounding this war is not simply about Iran. It is about endurance. Can the United States manage multiple strategic theaters without losing cohesion, without exhausting its political capital, and without allowing rivals to reshape the balance of power while attention is divided? That question will not be answered in a single battle. It will be answered over time, through decisions made in Washington, through the stability of alliances, and through the ability of American leadership to maintain strategic discipline in a world where crises rarely occur one at a time. Because in the modern era of global competition, the ultimate victor is often not the nation that strikes first. It is the nation that sustains power the longest. We've walked through a complex story, one that stretches from the Middle East to the Pacific Ocean, from energy markets to military technology, and from the halls of Congress to the strategic calculations of Beijing and Taipei. At the center of it all is a simple but powerful reality. In today's interconnected world, no conflict remains isolated. When President Donald Trump authorized strikes against Iran, the immediate goal was to neutralize a threat and prevent further escalation in the region. But as we've seen, the ripple effects of that decision travel far beyond the battlefield. Allies in Asia are watching closely. Energy markets are shifting, military doctrines are being tested, and global competitors are quietly evaluating how the balance of power might change. This story is not just about missiles, oil, or diplomacy. It is about how nations manage pressure when multiple crises collide at the same time. History shows that the strongest powers are not necessarily the ones with the biggest armies or the most advanced technology. The strongest powers are the ones that maintain clarity, discipline, and strategic focus when the world becomes chaotic. That lesson applies not only to governments but to our own lives. Every one of us faces moments when challenges come from different directions at once: work, family, finances, uncertainty about the future. The temptation in those moments is to react emotionally or lose focus. But the deeper lesson from geopolitics is that resilience comes from prioritizing wisely, staying calm under pressure, and thinking long-term rather than reacting to every short-term crisis. Now I'd like to hear your thoughts with a quick question. Do you believe a prolonged conflict with Iran would ultimately weaken America's global position or strengthen it by reinforcing deterrence? A. It would weaken the United States by stretching resources and attention. B. It would strengthen the United States by demonstrating decisive leadership. Comment A or B below so we can see how the community views this issue. And beyond that question, what's your perspective on the bigger picture? Do you think the United States can manage multiple global challenges at once while maintaining stability in Asia and the Middle East? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can learn from different viewpoints. If you appreciate deep analysis like this and want more content that explains the forces shaping our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations going and motivates us to continue producing thoughtful, in-depth videos in the future.